Why would a woman set out to climb the tallest mountain she could find? For the same reason a man would, of course. Because it's there. The Gilded Age pioneer whose ambition shattered glass ceilings at the very top of the world. Next.
Oh, New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine. The sawdust is gone from the floor where we harmonize sweet Adeline. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.
Hello, history lovers, and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Karayanis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. Now #1 in podcasting, thanks to discerning listeners like you. In this episode, our time machine welcomes aboard royalty of a sort, one whose throne rose into the clouds themselves. The book is Queen of the Mountaineers, the trailblazing life of Fanny Bullock Workman. Our sherpa as we climb through this compelling woman's life is Cathryn J. Prince, whose previous books include American Daredevil, Death in the Baltic, and Shot from the Sky. Cathryn has worked as a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor in Switzerland and in New York, where she reported on the United Nations and is a frequent contributor to the Times of Israel and fine magazines everywhere. Visit her at cathrynjprince.com, at cjprince7676 on Instagram, or Cathryn Prince on Twitter. That first name is spelled Cathryn. Okay, now that we've packed up our climbing gear and practiced our knots, let's join Cathryn Prince and bow to the courage of the woman they called Queen of the Mountaineers. I'm joined on the line by Cathryn J. Prince, who brings us Queen of the Mountaineers, the trailblazing life of Fanny Bullock. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with the History Author Show, Cathryn.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I'd like to start where Queen of the Mountaineers does, and that's with the cover. There's a photo of your subject, and it shows Fanny Workman with a pile of mountaineering equipment, a big heap of stuff that I think any of us can relate to if we have a big project going, or maybe if we've ever gone camping. When you go on vacation, you have all of that stuff and you're not sure where you're going to find anything. But she looks like she knows where her stuff is. She looks like she's a little bit weary there, a little tired. I've heard some people compare it to the expression of a 3-year-old when they look at a photo like this, where they say, they're going to give you exactly 3 seconds, and you better get that picture because they're going to run off. So this is the expression she's wearing on her face on the cover of Queen of the Mountaineers. But it's what she's not wearing that's surprising. She's not wearing pants. She's wearing a dress. And I imagine if you were going mountaineering, especially 100 years ago when it's a male-dominated field and you want to get going and you want to break into it and you want comfort. For instance, women riding horses, they would wear pants later, and that was a big fight for them to be able to wear pants. Or bicycles, where they had the women's bicycle with the dip in the frame so that they could wear skirts. So this was a big deal. When I looked at that, I really got to know her just from looking at that picture and her face. So tell us about her. What does this photo tell us? How do you choose that for the cover?
So choosing that photo for the cover, as you know, she took a lot of photos. She loved photographing her subjects and her trips. And her husband also took a lot of photos. And this one stood out to us for some of the reasons that you say. You really get a good look at her determination and her no-nonsense attitude. And also, she always seemed to have this impatience to just get on with the climb, just get on with the descent, whatever they were doing. She rarely smiles in photographs. But the other point I would say is about the skirt. Like you said, here's Fanny, who is an advocate for women's rights, but she purposely chooses to wear a skirt. And at first glance, that might seem to contradict her conviction, the idea that women are equal to men. And so, you think, oh, she'll definitely wear pants. It was both her personal preference not to, but there was also, she was pretty savvy. She knew that wearing a skirt would get her noticed. So if you see photos of her group shots on the summit, immediately which one is Fanny Bullock Workman, because she has the skirt on. Huh. So it was also a way for her to stand out. She'd be easy to spot. You're always going to go to her first. And so it was an interesting way to send what I think was her unmistakable message that women were equal to the task at hand. And it's interesting, too, because, as we'll talk a little bit later, her rival wore pants. And this is coming just out of this era where there were laws against women wearing pants. You could get arrested for wearing pants just, a few decades before that. And there were a lot of political cartoons at the time, showing that, if women were in pants, that they were going to emasculate men. And so she's just kind of coming out of that era. But I thought it was really interesting what it said about her and her knowledge and the way she understood she also needed to, I don't want to say play the press, but just how to use media to get her message across. And she knew, with that outfit, you're going to know who's who up on the mountain.
It reminds me of a phrase from college, the idea of conforming by not conforming. By the late 80s, the example that someone said to me was, there shouldn't be hippies anymore. You're way too old to be a literal hippie. You can be influenced by that culture, and people know your parents maybe had that age, but you should be something unique and to yourself. You don't have to go right down the list and check all of the things that a hippie would be, because it's just acting a part. It's not being yourself. And for her, I like that she thought that she wasn't going to wear pants just because. She really put thought into it. It's a chapter that you have, chapter 4. That's the title, Steadfast in Skirts. And I thought, having read about her and gotten to know her in Queen of the Mountaineers, that made a lot of sense to me. I said, that's exactly who she is, and she was going to wear it. And what you say makes perfect sense. She was going to stand out. And the fact that she could wear pants didn't matter. That wasn't the important thing. I think, especially mountaineering, it's something that you have to keep your mind on that mountain. You have to keep your mind on climbing, and you have to choose your steps carefully. Your mind wanders, and that's it. You could slip, you could fall, you could kill yourself or somebody else. And she's climbing with her husband the whole time. So I like that keen, sharp mind that she has.
Yeah, and just one more thing about the pants. Later on, when she does get into the dispute over the altitude, she does, she makes one or two little digs at her rival about the pants, and kind of, going back to that, well, I'm not going to do it just because someone else is. And she's very true to her character. She doesn't pretend to be anyone other than Fanny Bullock Workman. She is very true to herself.
I mentioned the time periods and how things change, technology and attitudes. That's what I want to reach at next, because the logistics of mountain climbing in Fanny Bullock Workman's era can't possibly compare to the 21st century. And that's something that when I was reading Queen of the Mountaineers, I tried to put myself in that mindset. And it's not easy. I find even watching TV shows that are from 30 years ago, say, much less a movie that's from much farther back, you expect the person to whip out their cell phone. You expect them just to call somebody sometimes. And it's a little strange. I have a colleague, and he says his daughter asks him when he tells a story, well, show me the video, show me the pictures of it, because she's grown up with her whole life being videoed and taking pictures. And he said, no, and we didn't have phones with cameras in our pocket. We just had to live things and remember what actually happened. So, if you want to hear the story, that's all it's going to be, is me telling you the story. It's not going to be a multimedia presentation. So it's great that she took many pictures, did Fanny Bullock Workman, But I wanted to ask you to put us in that mindset here in the 20th century. Explain to us, not only does she have no GPS, you mentioned the controversy later about her height and how high, what her altitude was.
Mhm.
Explain to us the technology that was involved, some of the things that are here in this pile that's on the cover of Queen of the Mountaineers.
Right. She starts the cycling expeditions in the 19th century. So she's just the turn of the, she bridges the 19th, 20th century. And so the sheer logistics of it, I found just in the research, it could exhaust you just seeing what she had to do to get to where she wanted to go to even begin exploring. We could think of, oh, that's, you got a long flight and car travel, and it might still only be ultimately a day or two of travel to get to where you want to go. She's got weeks of travel just to get to where she wants to go. She's often leaving from Germany. She'll get on a train. She may take the train to Marseille, and then she's got the boat, and then she's in India, and then she's got another train and horses and mules. So just moving her, it's not point A to point B. It's like this zigzag, really arduous journey, which if I think now, she had danger just to get to where she wanted to start. One thing I think that people see that are similar, she also had to contend with visas and permits and bureaucrats, the way that I think people, it depends on where you're exploring, have to go through for today. And the other thing, just comparing time, is her supplies. She has no lightweight fabrics, no Gore-Tex or dry fit or dehydrated foods. First aid, she doesn't have quick clot or antibiotics or Neosporin. I mean, they have to bring in every single thing, from the bandages to sewing needles to tins of meat. She brings in sheep and chicken that they're going to later have to butcher to eat. So I just kept feeling like she has these caravans of people and equipment with her. No GPS, no satellite phone. So they know if something happens, they're not going to be able to get help so quickly. As for the measuring, that's also just completely different. As some mountain climbers explained to me, triangulation is still used, but that was the main thing that they used back then. It was just more rudimentary in Fanny's day. By the time the workmen start doing that, it's a centuries-old technique, and they would have to take direction plots from two separate locations, and then they graph that, and they superimpose the graphing paper, and you get a scale model of the landscape. And I'm giving you a really rough sketch of how that works. And they'd also use barometers for measuring as well. So it was a little bit more rudimentary than we have now. The principle was the same, but they couldn't just plot it on a GPS. They don't have satellite phones or anything like that. So there were a lot of corrections later made to some of their measurements. She still held that altitude record that stood the test of time for her, but there would be later corrections by 50 feet, 25 feet, 100 feet, that they would even go back and have to correct.
No medevac chopper for her if she gets injured either. All these things you think of. And you're talking about planning the trip. She might not even have known where she was going. Certainly when you go up there, I'm watching her go through these trips with her husband, William Hunter Workman. It's really into the unknown. It's great to see a couple that does those things together, that did those things together. Here I'm talking about them like I know them, because I feel like that after reading Queen of the Mountaineers. But that's the thing. You're watching them go on these adventures together. They're conquering mountains. They're doing it all with support. They're doing it all together. It's not something where she runs off on her own.
Right.
This is something where Anna Smith Peck, her rival that we've hinted at a couple of times, is a single woman, and she doesn't have the means that Fanny has. And that makes Fanny even more compelling, though, that she's there with a husband, with a family, with this comfortable life that she decides to leave behind. It would be so easy for her to just sit there in the drawing room, just be one of the visitors to a place like Downton Abbey, let's say, or just hang out in New York on Fifth Avenue. What is all this craziness with carrying your own chickens to slaughter them? You do not have to do this. But she does. She chooses to. So what is it about her upbringing and her family, the nature versus nurture? Clearly she wanted to go up at the mountain and wanted to climb the mountains with her husband. What was it about her family upbringing and then about finding a husband that's going to support you in those things, not tell you, no, don't do that? We all are familiar with spouses. Maybe our own spouses don't want us to do things. I had a friend and he said, well, this motorcycle's going for sale as soon as I get married, right? So it's that kind of thing, which incidentally I supported because I didn't want it to end up splattered all over the Garden State Parkway or anything.
Right.
That's
Right.
something about her that you wonder. She is not the fictional character. If you decided you were going to draw a fictional character from this era that was going to be a mountain climber, there's nothing about her that I'm reading that says to me, yeah, this is a woman who's going to travel 7 weeks to get to the Matterhorn or wherever and climb that mountain.
Yeah.
So where does she come from?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because actually, there's a few maybe little clues in her personality, but not a lot. Not when you think about, she grows up and her family's progressive to a point. She was born in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her father was governor of the state. He was something of an abolitionist. His name is not really one of the ones that we know, but he was. But her mother was very typical of their socioeconomic level. She did her philanthropy and charitable work and was, active in their community. But her mother was by no means pursuing a profession, and certainly not anything like mountain climbing or cycling tens of thousands of miles. Where we see Fanny's independent streak come out is they send her abroad for finishing school, which again was pretty common for people of her socioeconomic level. And they think she's going to go and she'll perfect her French, her German, and probably, at least from her parents' point of view, and she'll, find a husband overseas. And she comes home fluent in French and German and no husband. It's not interesting to her at that point. She writes a few short stories, and she actually does get them published. And the thing about the short stories that stood out to me most was that the protagonists in them seem to be a thinly veiled Fanny, Bullock, Workman, which is, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to be independent. Somehow there's these like romances that just don't quite work out. So she doesn't come home really set on getting married, but she meets William Hunter Workman. It's not really clear how they met. They traveled in the same circles, and she always calls him Hunter. That's her nickname for him. And like you said, he's not just supportive of her. He wants to go along and do this with her. And so they start climbing in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and then eventually decide they're going to move overseas. And I think today we would consider him definitely a feminist because he's supportive, he champions her, he relishes seeing her, in the limelight and spearheading these expeditions, and he's very encouraging of her. And then when they have children, he's the same way with their daughter, Rachel. So I think that part of that you have to chalk up to luck. I don't think that she knew initially that he would be so on the same page with her, with everything that they were doing. But he did. So they enjoyed decades of travel and expeditions together. And I think he was really content sometimes to kind of take the second seat to her being the lead on everything.
When they go off on those adventures, you mentioned that they have children. It means leaving their daughter, Rachel, almost to raise herself. And I thought about the Victorian parenting techniques that they had and that they would send their children away. But even by Victorian standards, never mind American Victorian standards, this was a lot of time of Rachel just sitting there, and there's no FaceTime. There's mail that's going to take just as many weeks to get back to you as it takes them to get where they're going. They have a son, Siegfried. He unfortunately passes away. That's a devastating, sad part of the book.
Yeah.
That doesn't ground them, though. They don't decide, well, we're going to stay at home. We're going to smother Rachel, now our remaining child, and be overprotective, which you could certainly understand. In fact, in a touching moment, the grieving parents, they're up on a mountain and they name a little nameless peak, Siegfried, after their boy. I wondered what it was about them that made them choose that chose to press on with the adventures, not give in to feeling guilty, not give in to the idea of overparenting and being overprotective of their surviving child, to give people a flavor of the woman that they're going to meet in Queen of the Mountaineers.
Yeah, I thought about that so much as I was researching it. I am a parent and trying to put myself, and I've left when my kids were younger for, reporting assignments or research, but I didn't leave for 6, 7, 8 months a year. And so it was really for trying to understand that part of Fanny was difficult in some ways. And she, after Siegfried died, it was devastating. And reading those last days and moments in her journal and Hunter's journal was just really poignant, and especially because Fanny really kept her emotions close to the vest. I think Hunter was much more emotive than she was, but she chose to forge on rather than, become overprotective. I think that she was true to herself, going back to the idea that, she wears skirts. She is an explorer. She is going to do these expeditions. And that part of her she didn't squelch, and it didn't die. And I think in some ways she realized staying home wasn't going to make Rachel safer. And I think Siegfried's death actually showed her that. I think we also realized they did live in the Victorian era, those initial years when childhood mortality rates were higher. Not that that would make it easier, but I think it was maybe more of a part of life than today. And I think she also, came to realize she found refuge in her travels and in her explorations. So where she wasn't staying home before, she just wasn't going to after. That was the way she dealt with it. It was interesting, trying to put my own way. I think I might have handled that, but that's how she did.
Any good hero needs a rival, and we spoke about Anna Smith Peck, who is the rival of Queen of the Mountaineers, as is the name of your title of your book. Mm-hmm. She's a competitor. She's 10 years older than Fanny Bullock Workman, and she does lack those resources. She doesn't have a husband. She's wearing pants. It's a very nice juxtaposition. I mentioned if you were writing a novel that this would be an incredible backstory here to give Fanny. Well, this is a great rival for her. This is a case of a real life story that you have exciting people that are both so driven, that are both trying to succeed. And I found it amazing that it's a true story of a true person. She was just as fascinating and holding my interest as her picture on the cover of Queen of the Mountaineers. It was almost as if she stuffed me into that pack there and strapped me to a mule and said, come on, you're coming along with us to climb these mountains and for 400 pages or whatever the story is. And it was exciting. I loved it. Of course, I was able to go sleep in a nice soft bed at night.
Right.
Anna Smith Peck, she's competing with her. She's seeing her get the headlines. She's wanting headlines on her own. They're going back and forth. As with novelists, as with somebody writing a book, you want to boost that narrative of a feud between the famous people. And the media, I could tell you, certainly having worked in it, a fight between two women, that's something even more exciting for them. Because in this era, particularly, we don't expect two women to be rivals like that. So tell us what the real relationship was like, as readers will discover it in your book.
Right. It sounds like, they're just like us, Annie Peck and Fanny Bullock Workman. What's interesting is, I think of them as a precursor to the Tanya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan a bit, in the way that the media wanted to play them off each other.
I was just thinking the same thing. It's so funny that you said it, because we did not discuss it before, but that's just what was popping into my head. That's how they want to play it up. Of course, she didn't, nobody came and whacked Fanny here in the leg, fortunately, but
no,
might have been tempting, but
maybe she wanted to. No. And here's a spoiler alert, but and it's really not, because it's history. So it's the two never met, which I was so intrigued like that when I discovered that. As I'm researching it, I thought, wow, because their relationship became all the more intriguing to me, because they had this intense feeling of competition and this idea of one pursuing the other. I kind of felt like they always felt like the other one was breathing down the other's neck, but they never met face to face. And even so, they had this certain amount of disdain for one another, because they really were polar opposites. Like I couldn't have dreamed up better opponents, because you have Fanny Bullock Workman, who is moneyed and she's married, she's a mother. She wants to spend $13,000 in 1906 money to retrace Annie Peck's climb to settle the dispute, she doesn't have to think about it. Whereas Annie Peck is single, she has no children, she scrapes by. She really, when she lectures, she needs that money. She has to fundraise for every expedition. So they really are polar opposites. But really was amazing, though, when outside influences, some of the newspapers, tried to exploit these differences and their dispute over the altitude and try to personalize it a little bit. Both women said, hold off. They each wrote to different editors of newspapers that this dispute, our rivalry, is not about our personalities, and it's about the science, it's about the numbers, and it's about the altitude. And that was really interesting because you get the sense that even though they didn't meet and they didn't like each other, they still wanted it to be just about the adventure, the exploration, and the altitude record. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I think in 2019, we still see that, when women are facing off in sports or entertainment or, many different arenas where people want it to be a little bit more sensational than it needs to be.
You mentioned that dispute about the altitude a couple of times and about the science, because I want listeners to understand that when you pick up Queen of the Mountaineers, you're not just getting again and again a travel log of places she's going and staying. It's not like that Foder's Guide to Fanny Bullock does whatever mountain. She
Right.
is expanding human knowledge. She's trying to advance the frontier of science at the time. But since you mentioned that rivalry or that dispute over the altitude, bring us up to date on that and how that relates to the scientific endeavor that they're both going into.
So it's in 1906, and what happens is Fanny Bullock Workman she broke her own record about 3 times or so, and the final one is that she climbs 23,000. At the time she thinks it's 23,500 feet. It turns out it's a little bit less, like 23,100, 23,200. Meanwhile, Annie Peck is off in South America, and she's climbing in Peru, Mount Huascaran, and she has 5 attempts on that peak. She finally climbs to the top, and she actually doesn't take the altitude reading, but she claims that she has now the altitude record. So when Fanny hears about this, across the ocean, she's like deep in the Himalayas. She is not having it. So that's when she sends these surveyors to triangulate the other mountain. And it's a dispute. It goes on for almost a year because they have to do this, second measurement, and then the American Alpine Club weighs in, and ultimately it settles in Fanny's favor that she does have the altitude record. But what both of those climbs do and what the dispute does is it does help advance scientific knowledge. It does, because you've got these surveyors taking measurements of peaks that haven't been climbed before. In Fanny's case, she's mapping with her husband. They're mapping glaciers that have been previously unmapped, and they make corrections when they know of them, and in some cases there's corrections made later. So I think of it as any science today, when someone discovers something or finds something, they write that first foundational paper, and then you can build off from that and correct it and alter it and tweak it. And so a lot of their climbing was that as well. A lot of their exploration helped do that as well. And she went about getting awareness to that by lecturing. She lectured extensively, and there was a lot of newspaper and magazine articles and interviews that they gave.
You're enjoying my conversation with Cathryn J. Prince, author of Queen of the Mountaineers, The Trailblazing Life of Fanny Bullock Workman. You can find our guest online at cathrynjprince.com, at cjprince7676 on Instagram, or Cathryn Prince on Twitter. Elizabeth Renetsky, author and documentary film director of Chasing Portraits, writes of the book, quote, Cathryn J. Prince digs into original journals, manuscripts, and photos to reveal a woman whose ambition broke boundaries for mountaineers in general and women climbers in particular. Cathryn, the original journals, manuscripts, and photos mentioned in that review makes my ears perk up because it brings to mind somebody that I read you thanked in the acknowledgments of Queen of the Mountaineers. And I'm excited about this book. So my occasional stumble is why I feel like I'm right there on that mule with her going up the mountains. And wow, you have her journals, her manuscripts, her photos,
Right.
especially the journals when, as you're saying, she's somebody who didn't emote a lot, didn't navel gaze or tell us all about her feelings.
Yeah.
She didn't have Instagram and Twitter and wasn't a product of our modern age where we're out there saying, why me? Why anybody when things happen, right?
Yeah.
And so when I saw the name David Peck, I thought, how did he flesh out this story of this rivalry, and how is he related to Annie S. Peck?
He helped flesh out more, I would say, a bit of the family lore and the personality. So he's a distant relative of Annie Peck because she didn't have children. So distant through the cousins, she had siblings. And what was interesting, we emailed, and he knew, about her adventuresome nature, and it was just fascinating that he was able to kind of just round out the family lore a little bit about her and about her trips, her love of adventure. And interestingly, this many generations later, that's actually something that he feels his own sense of adventure. And he sent me a lot of photos, and I think he had done a bit of a blog for a while on some of his own travel. And he just, credited that to Annie Peck. And so it was kind of an interesting little icing on the cake to have someone and kind of see through the generations. Again, it's that nature versus nurture. Was that adventuresome, in the Peck family genes? It seems to be in David's as well. So he was kind of an interesting, addition to be able to talk to someone who had some connection to Annie.
How did you find him and get in touch?
Oh, so there is a website that you might be familiar with called Find a Grave.
Yeah,
Do you
sure.
know that one?
So my best friends are there.
Yeah, okay. So I say it, I feel like when I say it, people are like, what? But there is a website, Find a Grave, and it's good for getting a start for seeing some family genealogy. And he was on the Annie Peck one as not an administrator. I don't remember how the genealogy or someone who had visited the website. So I basically just cold emailed him, which I do a lot for reporting and research, and say, like, are you actually related? And if you are, I would like to ask you a few questions. And that's how I found David on Find a Grave.
And he was just all too happy to speak, which is great because sometimes you can't. You mentioned about Find a Grave, and because my wife is a genealogist, you can see the link there at historyauthor.com. But we were working on one of the sides of my family tree, and we were working with a cousin of mine, Zap. He's a magician, and that's what he goes by, Zap the magician. If you look him up over there in London, he travels all over. And well, I was talking to him, and he was helping her so much because he goes to Cyprus. That's where my mother's side of the family is.
Right.
And because of the Turkish invasion, they lost their land, and there was all these challenges to doing it. But people is the one resource. And he called this one cousin so many times, and he said, gosh, every time I call, he hangs up on me. I'm trying to tell him, I'm not trying to sell you anything. Don't hang up on me. I'm a cousin of yours that you've never met. And so it's just so great when somebody like David Peck picks up the phone and is willing to be open and answer it. It's just so nice. And I think, having been in the media business, having done that kind of thing, sometimes you get such terrible responses, and it's disheartening because you only want to help the relative of this person. If, for instance, if people are familiar with the website Sherpa, where they have all those great old high resolution photographs, that's named after this young man. I think his name is also Adam Sherpa is his name. Also Higginbotham. I mentioned this other Higginbotham recently, and they said, we contacted some of the descendants, but they didn't seem really interested. They weren't off-putting. They weren't rude to us. They just were like, okay, so he was a coal miner in Alabama, I believe it was. And it's like, man, it's just so great that he's willing to share with you and flesh that out, because Because as I feel here, looking at the cover of Queen of the Mountaineers, I want to know this woman's story. And this is touching a little piece of her and getting some things filled in. And I imagine for you, you were
Right.
probably trying to say, okay, hold back your passion a little, and sort of like fishing. You got to just bring the guy in a little at a time, because otherwise you could think you're crazy or you want to know too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Who are you?
David Peck, the fact that he was open with you deserved a shout out. I was glad to see that in the acknowledgments, because here's a woman that you describe as feeling she's David to Fanny Workman's Goliath. She has to go fundraise, all those things that
Right.
you mentioned before.
Yeah.
You can relate to, because I don't think any of us, when we're reading Queen of the Mountaineers, identify with somebody who's going to drop 13 grand to go check somebody else's math.
Right.
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 And
right. No.
yet Peck has her own style. She has her own little character things,
Mhm.
like the mustache she draws on her woolen climbing mask. How cool is that? You know?
Right.
Because people are going to expect to see a man up there.
Right.
She's compelling in her own right. And
Right.
I wonder if you ever considered writing a biography on her life, or maybe putting both women in together. You could have called it Queens of the Mountaineers or something like that, and said, because it seems as if Fanny, again, could have muscled her way into your story. And I feel a little bit bad for her that she just gets shoved into the also ran line, but that's her role. And certainly Fanny deserved her own book. So how do you choose to do that? How do you decide to narrow down your research and just focus on Fanny Workman?
So the short answer is I didn't decide straight out, and I definitely did not narrow my research straight out. So I think, just like with reporting, I like to over-research and over-report. So I begin my books the same way I'll begin a newspaper story, which is basically I have a solid sense of what I think the story is, but my mind is open to where the story might lead. Initially, I had actually started my research at Brooklyn College, where Annie Peck's papers are housed. So it's kind of, and I started it there first, mostly because convenience. Brooklyn is closer to Connecticut than Scotland, than Edinburgh, where Workman's papers are. So as I was deep into that research, I kept thinking, oh, maybe I'll flip the story and I'm just going to focus on Peck. But then Fanny Workman just kind of kept tugging at me. And so the more I researched, I knew I would definitely want it to give Annie Peck her due. And I slowly started to realize she's going to be the supporting character. And my decision ultimately to focus on Fanny was I found Fanny just a little bit more complicated, more contradictory. And so for me, that just held more fascination for me, just as an author and as a writer, to kind of dig into someone who wasn't complete, who was complicated, who wasn't, 100% likable, to use that word that gets used, but she was really interesting that way. So I decided then ultimately I knew that it was going to be Workman who I focused on. And I thought that Workman, even in some ways more than Annie, that Fanny Workman represented so much of what we continue to debate today, which is a woman's role and a mother's role and a wife's role in society. And so kind of for those reasons, she sort of emerged as the leading lady of the story, and Annie became that supporting character.
Because I think if you put them side by side, you would have bet on Annie Peck being the one who was a mountain climber. It made more sense. It doesn't bug us. Okay, she's from the wearing the pants to the being single to having a more modest life and more modest means to achieve this. Whereas Fanny Workman, you say, wow, you did all of this. Why would you do it? And it makes us look at ourselves and say, well, okay, just because it's there, that's why. The same reason anyone does anything, the same reason that a man does it.
Right.
Fanny is the first woman to map the most distant reaches of the Himalayan mountains. Next time you look at a globe, think about that. Think about how far it would have been 100 years ago. She's just the second to address the Royal Geographic Society of London. What other firsts did this trailblazer, as your subhead calls her, contribute during her years of climbing?
So she was the first woman to address the Sorbonne and in Paris. She was the first woman to cycle the length of India. She and Hunter, that was before they turned to mountain climbing. They started at the south and went north. She was the first to camp higher than 19,000 feet. So they camped for, I forget how many nights right now, consecutive over 19,000 feet. And then she was the first woman to climb higher than 23,000 feet. So those were her big firsts, which I don't think I will do one of them. I have to say.
Yeah, you say it's easy to tick them off.
It's safe to say I will research all of it and wrote about it, but I will not be doing any of those.
Yeah, just when you said biking all the way the length of India,
Yeah.
think about how big.
In her woolen skirt.
Yeah, and it's not like it's all flat, right? Right, wearing a skirt.
No.
I forgot about that. I mean, I
And
wouldn't do
wool.
it in pants. Yeah, wool.
Yeah,
No wonder she looks tired on the cover, right?
I know.
And again, not something that she had to do.
Yeah.
That's what makes her fascinating.
Right.
To go to these places where you
Right.
are going to be so out of touch. For instance, Queen of the Mountaineers recounts her trip to Algeria and how she recoils at the treatment of women there. So she's throwing herself into that. She doesn't have to. She can stay in that comfortable life. And I think that that's something that compels us with historical figures, whether it's one of the Roosevelts or we look at the Kennedys or we look at the founding fathers who didn't have to risk their fortunes, their lives, and live in that misery at the winter at Valley Forge, things like that. They could have just been comfortable, and yet they choose to do something with their life that's completely outside of that comfort zone.
Right.
She observes, for instance, in Algeria that there's no celebration when a girl is born compared to a boy. And she has to deal with that if she's going to be there, and she is cut off. She can have her husband there with her, but it's the two of them. At one point, she has to whip out a gun, right? Points it in a guy's face.
Yeah.
They're trying
More
to,
than one.
Yeah, trying to waylay her. I mean, she's not to be messed with. If people think Fanny is sort of an old lady name, somebody who you just pat on the head at the bingo parlor, imagine getting your face ventilated by a woman named Fanny because you try to mug her. It's not going to happen. So but she has to work with people from all of these different cultures. She has guides, she has staff. There's at one point that one guide's trying to get her to cross a bridge and she's saying, it's going to fall apart under me. I am not crossing. So what is it about her personality that enables her to do that? Even though, as you mentioned, she's not a soft person. She's a tough, driven person. At a time when she's dealing with people that don't want a woman telling them what to do, that would very much prefer she take her skirt and her gear and go back and knit something in England or in Massachusetts. How does she confront that so that she can reach her chosen goal?
She was definitely demanding, and some of her guides were not shy about saying that about her. And she was driven, and she did have, and so did Hunter, they did have tense relations with a lot of the porters that they hired, and definitely some of the guys. There's that one scene with Matthias Zurbriggen where they get into a bit of a screaming match at one point. He's a famous alpine guide, climber, and she basically ultimately prevails because she's not asking them to do anything that she won't do. She's not saying, "Let me up the mountain." She goes up that mountain with them. And she's not complaining. So part of her able to finally get them to listen to her is that she's leading by example there. What's interesting, though, is her directness and her drive and her, at times, rudeness. She was not always please and thank you and polite, but those were traits that male explorers did not have to explain or justify. And she talks about that later, the sexism on the mountain and off the mountain. She could be snobbish. I mean, she certainly came from money, and she did sometimes have that attitude, but she was also socially conscious. So that also, I think, going back to that question of why I wanted to write about her, because she had all these dualities. But she wrote in 1895, so even before she starts climbing, and this goes back to that time when she's cycling through Algeria and Spain, and she wrote, "The advance of a nation in modern ideas may be judged by the position occupied by its women." And I love that, because I thought that is more than 100 years ago she's writing this. And she lived by that, on the mountain. So I think ultimately the guides come to respect her. The one she has that screaming match with ultimately comes to really respect her for what she accomplished. But it wasn't easy.
No, it doesn't seem it. And as you said,
It's not.
I don't think
Yeah.
either of us will be doing that anytime soon.
No.
I,
Wait,
you
maybe
know,
you, but good luck.
yeah, now we don't even walk to the store without making sure we have 6 bottles of water and emergency
Right.
flares and our cell phone. Can you imagine? Oh,
Yeah.
you have the vapors here over the idea of leaving your cell phone home because what if you have to call somebody or play Candy Crush or whatever? So
Right.
just to put yourself in the mindset of Queen of the Mountaineers and think about how she had to bring everything with her, bringing those animals with her so that she could
Hmm.
slaughter them, so that they could eat something, dealing with these people who you're going to have to go to bed. So if you fight with somebody and you
Hmm.
have to go to bed and go to sleep, you're not going to be whipping that gun out to protect yourself.
No.
Because she left this complete record, you're able to whittle it down for us and we get to enjoy it here
Mhm.
in Queen of the Mountaineers. But I wondered as I read that, as I always do, just as when I craft questions, I like to ask the question that the guest hasn't been asked 1,000 times before. So, were there any things that if she were here today, or if you could speak to a descendant of hers with a big pile of letters and some insight, that you wish she'd had a moment to jot down while clinging to the face of a cliff? What tidbit of information would you like to have at your fingertips?
So a few things that I would have liked to, at least if I could have asked her like in person, and they may not be entirely, they're not unserious questions, but I would have liked to know what she really thought. So in the book, she and her husband drink what she calls hunter's medicinal tea a lot, which the readers will find is basically really weak tea with its whiskey. And that would be like their end of a trek drink every night. So I kind of wondered what she really thought of that. But I also wanted to know, I'd love to know from her other mountains on other continents. Was she glad that she only focused on the Himalaya? When she stopped climbing in the eve of World War I, and then she got ill and was never able to climb again? And I wondered if there were other places she would have liked to go and explore. So that would have been helpful. And I think I would have wanted to probe a little bit more just about Annie Peck with her. What would she have liked to have actually been able to meet her in person? And if she did, what would she have said, or what would they have talked about? They're more, I think, personality questions that I would have liked to have been able to find out from her.
Well, we've just about reached the summit here, which, as we both have sheepishly confessed, is only ever going to be a metaphor. We're not going to be following in Fanny's footsteps trying to scale the Matterhorn or any Himalayan mountaintop. But we have time for one final question, and I wanted to give you a chance to make your pitch, because if listeners can't tell from the passion in my voice and tripping over myself to talk about how much I enjoyed Queen of the Mountaineers, why should a reader in 2019 who, like us, may never go higher than the top of a very tall hotel pick up Queen of the Mountaineers and meet this compelling woman and the cast of characters that surround her back before the World Wars?
Well, I think, my final pitch is that Fanny Workman's story is contemporary in that her experiences in the late 1800s and early 1900s serve as a model for a lot of the cultural discussions we're having today in 2019. She wanted women to be judged on their merit, and she strongly believed women should follow the path that was right for them and not the path society deemed correct. And I hope Fanny Workman's fortitude and feats on the mountain will amaze and delight readers and get you excited and make you feel like you are riding the mule to get into the Himalaya. But her achievements are undoubtedly impressive. Yet I think the real message underpinning her story is how she navigated and bucked tradition, and she lived a life with purpose and determination.
Well, Cathryn J. Prince, author of Queen of the Mountaineers, I thank you so much for putting me on this path and getting together all this climbing gear today to put me in the pages here, to put me on that trail following Fanny Bullock Workman and Annie Peck. I hope that readers will want to get on board too and take that walk with her, not just on the mountain, not just the mountain climbing. As you can tell, neither of us are big, huge adventure people who are up there with the oxygen tank trying to push higher and higher on K2. But yet we both enjoyed the story. That's a credit to you. I'm just the reader here, and now I'm just interviewing you. But I did enjoy it, and I think listeners, whatever their mountain is in their life that they would like to climb, whatever their path that they would like to walk, they'll learn something here from Queen of the Mountaineers, and they'll just get a great read. So best of luck with the book, and thank you again for sending it to me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Dean. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Again, the book is Queen of the Mountaineers, The Trailblazing Life of Fanny Bullock Workman. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at thehistoryauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our climb machine humming like usual. I have to thank Cathryn J. Prince for such a fun conversation. It's great that she joined us and introduced us to Fanny and her rival, Annie S. Peck. They're two women that defied stereotypes in their own day, and today, when we read about them, they make us question, too, how we judge a book by its cover. They defied convention in their own day, and today, they still have the power to make us as readers question what we assume when we judge a book by its cover. Visit CathrynJPrince.com, follow our guest at CJPrince7676 on Instagram, and toss her a follow at Cathryn Prince on Twitter. Remember, her name is spelled Cathryn. And while you're online, let us know what you think of the book and the interview on Twitter at HistoryDean, Instagram at The History Author Show, Instagram at The History Author Show, or Facebook.com/HistoryAuthor. That's it for this installment of The History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio, or enjoy one of the written Q&As we post at historyauthor.com from time to time. And if you're an iTunes subscriber, please take a minute to leave us a review. Well, until our next trip into the past together, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular